Good morning. I am Tyler McCann, Managing Director of the Canadian Agri-Food Policy Institute. Before we begin today's discussion, let me acknowledge that I come to you from Western Quebec, the traditional and unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe Nation. CAPI was created 17 years ago to bring insight, evidence, and policy solutions to the agri-food system in Canada. Our goal this morning is to bring insight and evidence into the impacts of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, what it means for agriculture in Ukraine and in Canada, and what the consequences are for the people around the world that rely on the food they produce for food security. Let us start by reaffirming our support for the Ukrainian people. The consequences of the invasion of Ukraine on the people there and in the region are difficult to comprehend. It has been horrific to watch the events unfold, but the strength and resilience of Ukrainians are an inspiration to people around the world. Let us also acknowledge that it is too early to know what the full extent of the fallout of the invasion will be. We do not know how long it will last. We do not know whether farmers in Ukraine or in Russia will be able to get seed in the ground or harvest their winter wheat. We do not know how long the Black Sea will be closed. We do not know what the full impact of the financial sanctions are. We do not know how much worse it will get before it gets better. However, the panelists today will help us understand the factors that are impacting agriculture and food systems in Canada and Ukraine and in the international markets that connect them and offer insight and evidence on the possible scenarios that may unfold. I will begin the webinar by introducing each panelist individually and asking them a question based on their experience and expertise. Then we will move to questions for the group and questions from the audience. We encourage you to write your questions using the Q&A function in the bottom of your screen. I'm going to start this morning with Shane Knutson. Shane has spent the last 24 years in international business, marketing Canadian farm equipment and infrastructure around the globe, including a cumulative 1.5 years in Russia and Ukraine. He grew up on a family farm in Manitoba and currently serves as the president of Polywest Limited, based in Winnipeg, Canada. Shane, thank you for joining us this morning. You've spent almost 25 years doing business in Ukraine and in Russia during a period when agriculture there has undergone a significant transformation. Ukraine has gone from being a major importer to a significant exporter. I think an important place to start this morning is to understand what would be happening on farms and in agriculture in their system today and in the weeks ahead if it weren't for the brutal invasion. And what do you think may actually happen? And while most of the focus has been on Ukrainian production, I'd also like you to comment on the situation likely facing Russian agriculture and provide a global view on the likely impacts on production and exports from the region. Thank you, Shane.
Thanks. Thanks for having me, Tyler. That's a lot of questions kind of loaded all into one. So I apologize if I didn't answer any of those right off the bat, but maybe you can help me as I go along. So if you we're asking what's a typical farmer either in Ukraine or Russia doing at this time of the year, the answer is fairly similar to what Canadian farmers are doing this time of the year. So they're getting their equipment ready for seeding. The difference would be that a lot of the wheat and some of the other coarse grains have already been put in terms of 95% of that is winter wheat, similar to what happens in Europe. But certainly the corn and the sunflowers in Ukraine, which is a big portion of their crop, those get drilled and seeded in the ground in May timeframe, end of April, beginning of May, similar to what we do here. So that is what's most farmers would be doing this time of the year. In terms of the ports themselves, because both Russia and Ukraine export a significant percentage of the crop that they produce there. So in total, Ukraine grows 86 million metric tons of grain. That's total grain, so that includes the wheat, corn, and the not sunflowers, but the other crops like barley and sorghum and things of that nature. So 86 million tons, of which 61 million tons gets exported. And to put that in perspective, the 86 million tons on a total production basis for the world is not large, but the 61 million tons that exported is significant because that represents 12% of the total grains crop that is traded around the globe. And then on the edible oil side of things, Ukraine is one of the largest producers of sunflowers, either first or second. I apologize, I don't know the exact answer to that, but they grow 17.5 million metric tons of sunflowers, a lot of which is crushed. At least half of it's crushed in Ukraine, and 91% of that is exported. So in terms of on a global scale, we trade 188 million metric tons of edible oils around the globe, and that represents 16 million metric tons, which is about 8% of global trade. So that has an effect here in Canada. That has an effect around the globe because that's what everybody's talking about: food and scarcities or potential scarcities thereof if that doesn't happen and that those commodities don't make the market. But I think, as Tyler and I discussed before, it's not just Ukraine, it's what's happening in Russia, because there's going to be a change in trade for sure. Again, the wheat, of which 80% of Russia's crop, or 70% of their crop is wheat. That's been sown already. The corn and the rest of the crops are going into the ground in the springtime. Likely nothing's going to change there. That those crops will go in the ground, except for the fact that commodity or there may be a problem with crop inputs given their currency situation right now. What will be changed for sure is the market for those crops. So of the 120 million metric tons approximately of grains and oilseeds Russia grows, 45 million metric tons is exported. The majority of that's wheat, 35 million metric tons, and that represents 17% of the global trade. So combined together, wheat on the Ukrainian side and wheat on the Russian side represents almost 30% of the global trade of wheat, and that's why you see prices shooting way up on wheat. Corn would be the next largest percentage there, and that's probably not a little bit more elastic than wheat production and things of that nature, but we can talk about that later. But what I was saying is that all of those crops, the customers are going to change for Russia because of embargoes. But the most significant thing is the Black Sea region is closed right now. So 90% of all grain in Russia and Ukraine is transported out using the Black Sea, and as we know, there's military vessels in there right now, and it's closed. So none of that product's moving, and that likely is 40% of the total exported would go between now and kind of the end of the harvest. So that's significant. It's building up, and who knows when it's going to start moving again.
And Shane, how much infrastructure is there to maintain these reserves, to maintain these stocks that are going to build up as grain doesn't move out of ports and harvest looks to happen? Do they have capacity to manage these stockpiles?
Well, if the grain goes in the ground, because when we're talking about Ukraine now, the question is between now and say May 1st, whether farmers will be able to concentrate on seeding, whether they'll actually have their equipment ready, whether there's lots of factors there. On the Russian side, certainly they will have the opportunity to do that, but will they have the money to put into fertilizer, some of the same things on that our farmers are going to be affected. If they get all of that in the ground and they have a decent harvest and they're able to harvest the crop, then they'll make do, but the quality is going to be down. So there's always the ability to store outside in piles, but we all know what happens then. We have degraded crops, and it's not food quality.
And one last question for you, Shane. What about options beyond the Black Sea? What's your sense of what could get moved by rail or could get to market other ways other than by maritime vessel?
Well, if you're talking about Ukraine, a lot of their oilseeds and some of their crop could be moved to Europe using traditional methods by truck or by rail. Russia, in all likelihood, China and possibly some of their Middle Eastern customers will continue to buy from Russia. There is the ability using the Trans-Siberian Railway to move product there. There is a small amount of capacity on the Far East where they have one or two ports, but it's not a significant, they won't be able to move the 45 million metric tons that they normally do out of Russia that way.
Okay, thank you, and thank you, Shane. We'll come back to you in a minute. I'd like to now look at the context on farms in Canada. Sébastien Pouliot is a principal agricultural economist at Farm Credit Canada. Prior to joining FCC in 2019, Sébastien was an associate professor of economics at Iowa State University. He's been involved as an expert in trade disputes at the World Trade Organization and was an editor of the Canadian Journal of Agricultural Economics between 2016 and 2019. Sébastien, we're going to share in the chat a link to some analysis that you wrote for FCC on the possible impacts of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. But I would ask you to start by sharing your highlights of that analysis, where you think the consequences may result in changes being made on farms. And I know you'll speak to the impact on grain producers, who are often at the forefront of people's thoughts here, but I would also like you to comment on the impact on livestock producers and livestock producer margins in Canada.
Well, thanks. So Shane already told us, what these movements, the quantities and so on, what are the impacts. Well, to summarize, it just means that there's fewer grain on the world market that's going to be available. And we see that the impact of that is raising grain and oilseed prices. So grain prices are way up, especially for wheat. We saw it last week. The wheat futures hit the limit 6 times. It has settled since then, but it shows us really that grain prices have been going up. And there are other impacts on the market, especially also on input prices. One obvious one is the price of oil, which impacts the price of gasoline, diesel. So for grain farmers, it's going to cost a lot more just to put the crop in or harvest in terms of diesel. And another important impact on inputs is the one on fertilizer. Russia and Belarus, that's also involved in the conflict, are facing a lot of sanctions right now, and they are important producers of potash. So that's going to have a positive impact on fertilizer prices. Already that we had high fertilizer prices starting the middle of last year because of several disruptions. If we think of a hurricane in the Gulf of Mexico, we had also high natural gas prices even before the Ukraine conflict, the Ukrainian war. So that meant we already had very high fertilizer prices, and now we're having some more pressure on that. I must add also that there's been export quotas by China for fertilizer, same thing with Russia. So it's all building up on higher fertilizer prices. I've got some forecasts in here about for fertilizer prices. These were run like 10 days ago. So they're not fully capturing the impact of the conflict, of the war right now. If we look at urea, we're talking, I'm looking in here at a crop year basis. So I'm going to compare 21-22 to 2020, 20 and 21, okay? So urea, we're talking about the price doubling from one crop year to the next. Ammonium phosphate, 65% up. Anhydrous ammonia, 65% up. So these are from our forecast. We already see much higher fertilizer prices, and they're just going to keep on increasing. These are on the lower end, given that we're not fully capturing the effect of the conflict, of the war here. And one impact it's going to have for us is we expect actually probably farmers to switch a little bit more toward crops that will ask for fewer inputs. So if we think on the east, it's probably going to be a little bit more soybean than corn, although the effect is a little bit ambiguous right now because we're having like corn prices and soybean prices both increasing, but inputs also increasing. So we still need to figure out a little bit what's going to be the end effect. But to mention also, we still expect actually that pretty much all crops in Canada, we expect them to be profitable. So even though input prices are going up, output prices are going up so much that we still expect crop farming to be profitable in 21, 22. And when it comes to livestock, well, grain prices is bad news. So it's going to be a lot more difficult for livestock producers, especially that, we just had a drought. So barley prices are very high in the prairies. The prairies is already importing a lot of corn from the United States because of that shortage. So it's going to just build on top of that to make the cost of feeding livestock a lot higher. So if we're looking at margins for beef, we see them essentially negative for 21, 22. And in hogs, though, we're seeing a little bit of positive margins in the middle of the year. So for farrow to finish operation, we expect like in July to see some profitability, but for the rest of the year, it's pretty much negative.
Thank you. One of the things that you talked about was the work that you're doing with forecasting and modeling. I was just wondering if you could speak to them. How do you do that in this relatively, at least in the historical context, unprecedented situation that we're in?
Yeah, it's very difficult because we're in a situation right now we've never observed. So a technical language, we say it's out of sample. So we're not working from a situation from which we can build from something we've observed before. So even though we had like high crop prices in 2007, 2008, or 2012, it was very different situations. And we didn't have also all these shocks on energy prices, or we had some shocks, but they were from different situations. So it makes forecasting a lot more difficult. In this case in here, we have to develop scenarios, make some assumptions. So we're relying more on our expert judgment to make these forecasts. There's some call that we must make on what sort of assumptions are reasonable. It's not only us, it's pretty much everyone in the industry right now. We're working from little to really forecast what's going on.
And based on what you've known and what you've experienced in the past, if you look back at 2011, for example, where high grain prices did pressure the livestock industry, what was the cycle at that time to see profitability return and for that to be adjusted into livestock production in Canada?
I don't have the timing exactly right, but what we saw is, so 2012, we had the drought in the US, corn productions went way down. What that meant is high corn prices, high soybean prices, and cattle producers especially were affected by that. So what they did, they downsized. They reduced the size of that herd. And that's what we're seeing right now too in the prairies because of the drought we had last summer. We're seeing that less in the case of hog. The demand for beef and pork remains strong, but it's really what's driving profitability right now in these sectors is really the cost of inputs. So we can expect cattle producers especially to downsize, and then we're going to see possibly a cycle where beef prices are going to we might see a little bit more beef coming on the market because of that downsizing right now. So beef prices might actually, I wouldn't say decline, but maybe not increase as much right now because of that. In the longer term, because we're going to have fewer cattle going onto the market, we might see beef prices going up and then cattle prices going back up, which means that profitability is going to go back up in possibly a year or two, because just following these cycles that are created naturally. So for the moment, it's tough. but we can expect, that typical cycle where profitability is going to come back in a year or two.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Sébastien. I'd like to turn to Ted now. Ted Bilyea is a distinguished fellow here at CAPI, looking at issues of strategic trade, and former chair of our board. Previously, Ted was president of Maple Leaf Foods International, and Ted led the largest exporter of food in Canada at the time. Ted has served as a board member for several global food companies and was inducted into the Canadian Agriculture Hall of Fame in 2018. Ted, what we want to do is try and look, understanding this impact of agriculture in Ukraine and Canada and what it means in global food systems. I was wondering if you can speak to how you see these consequences playing out around the world, what the potential impacts are on food security, and what that means for strategic alliances around the world as well. And maybe I'll add a question in, Ted, that's come in through the chat already. Is the enhanced Russia-China alliance a worry? So a lot for you to unpack there as well.
Yes, and thank you, Tyler. Maybe you can coach me on the different parts of the question as we go ahead. And I think you've got a great presentation already by Sébastien and Shane. They've set the stage perfectly, really. And so maybe I'll just stretch it out a little bit as you've asked, to the global side of it. And maybe if I could ask Elise to bring up one slide that, because I think it's very important that we understand where we're starting from in this. We're not starting from a normal situation at all. And so I don't know, Elise, if you got that handy?
Yes, Ted, we can see the FAO charts now.
Great. Okay, then I think the first thing to think about is that prior to the invasion, we had the highest global food prices in the FAO index since really the Great Grain Robbery. And I suspect most people on the call are too young to remember that. But we are going through a bit of a similar situation right now. So that took place where you can see on the bottom chart there, that big spike back in the 70s. That was in 1973. And it was so serious that because the Russians we didn't have satellite imagery in those days, and we did not know that the Russians had two crop failures. And they came in and bought US grain, simultaneous buys with the major grain companies, and essentially cleaned out the US of grain. And that forced an embargo that Richard Nixon put on grain. And shortly thereafter, Canada in 73, and shortly thereafter, Canada followed suit because we were about to be cleaned out of grain and oilseeds. And I remember it vividly because in that year, I had spent a year trying to develop the soybean exports to Japan. And I had finally 2 containers as a trial shipment, the first 2 ever to leave Canada. And I had to go to Ottawa to get a permit to allow those 2 containers out of the country. And it was like moving nuclear waste. So I think, I'm not trying to overportray it, but I do think when you look at the global food index there, and we're at that point again in time, that I think we have to consider, that's where we're starting from here. It's not a normal situation. So the other one on the right-hand side of that's the FAO stock use ratio. And we've had 5 years of declining stocks, despite the fact that globally, even though Canada didn't have a good crop last year, globally, it was not a bad crop at all. It was pretty good. So the other thing to remember is that wheat and corn and rice account for about 40% of all the calories in the world. And that's what we're talking about here, at least the first 2, or wheat and corn particularly. So can I ask Elise to go to the second slide, just so we can, this is what essentially Sébastien and Shane have talked about. But so the data is the same as they've talked about it, and it shows you what the impact is of the Russian and Ukraine put together on the world grain markets is significant. But below, you can see the effect of the fertilizer. And I bring that into the picture because that's going to be part and parcel of whether we have a decent crop in the coming year and next year. And so on the left-hand side, you've got the nitrogenous fertilizers, and the darker your colors in that, essentially the more you're importing of Russia or Russian in this case, nitrogenous fertilizers. And you can see there's a lot of people importing a lot of that. And on the right-hand side, you've got the situation with potash. And we already had embargoes against the Belarusian potash before we started. But again, you can see the effect of who's going to be hit the most in terms of crops from that point of view. And I would remind everybody that Brazil needs a lot of that to work. And you go to the third slide. We don't have too many of these, so I won't worry. Don't want to stress everybody with slides, but it's easier to explain it. The other thing that I think we have to remember, and this is an example of wheat, is the majority of the wheat stocks are not held by the exporters. That's it. That's not any longer. In China, China's expected to account for about 131 million tons of stock when you measure at the end of a year, or 47% of total global stocks of wheat. And the major exporters only hold 57 million tons. So if you look at what's really going on here, we are so dependent on a new crop, everything going right with a new crop, because essentially, if you take the world's consumption in this that we're talking about here in terms of wheat, 781 million tons, that'll the exporters, what the exporters hold in their hands, the major exporters, was 27 days. So in the case of corn and in the case of rice, China holds even more stocks. And you can go to the next slide. I think we're getting near the end. The thing I want to remind everybody is that came up in what Shane was saying is that, you know, we already had a crisis going on in the veg oil markets before this occurred. If you look at the veg way it's laid out there, palm is the largest veg oil, and it's in the blue, soy in the black, and rapeseed in the light color, and the red is the one that Shane was talking about, sunflower oil. We had the Malaysian price has gone through the roof in very short order due to a whole bunch of reasons that I won't lay out here. Some of them not very fixable very quickly. And then you had Indonesia, which is the largest exporter of palm, put restrictions on their exports because they were beginning to run short. At the same time, as we all know here, we had a bad crop of canola in Canada, and we've now got major disruption in the sunflower oil supply from Russia, and Ukraine because of the invasion. Add to that the fact that we all know we have a short crop of soya in South America, particularly in Brazil, and many countries are now trying to grab stock and stockpile in this situation. In fact, if many, I'm sure many of the people on the phone have contacts in the developing world, ask your contacts what they've been doing lately. I guarantee you most of them have been out trying to see if they can buy cooking oil. I actually talked to two of them in two different parts of the world in the last few days, and that's what they're both trying to do. So you can imagine that pressure. And maybe I think we're at the end here, the last one. This is just giving you a sense of when you, this is a map that we put together at CAPI. So it may or may not be exactly correct, but we think it is. And this is just looking at maize and barley imports from the Ukraine. Who's importing that in total? And the darker your color, the more of that you actually import from the Ukraine. The reason I bring this map up is to focus on the fact that I believe this is a point where we're going to see a lot of pressure to essentially change where meat is produced in the world. And you may ask why? Because if you look at the EU, some of their biggest meat exporters, Spain, for example, there you can see the Netherlands, Belgium, and to a lesser degree, of course, UK, Italy, Germany. These are significant meat exporters, but they're a long way from being. They're all net importers of grain and oilseeds too. So we learned in the meat business. I learned the first year as in Canada Packers, and because we were executing on this idea that you had to move, animals to grain. You couldn't move grain to animals. There's no economic logic in it. So everywhere where you see excessive surplus production that's far from grain or far from grass, that it's there because of essentially subsidies or high protectionism or both. And that's really a map of that when you get down to it. So I believe we are going to see a change. Europe is going to want to have more food security. Well, that's not going to be stuffing grain that you have to buy from long distances into animals. They're going to have to move more of that into food. And if you look at China, this is becoming a bigger issue for China as well. It's going to cost them a lot of money to execute the plan they have in mind already. So I think I'll stop there, Tyler. And did you have another question that you wanted?
Yes, Ted, I wanted to pick up on that last point on China. It came up in the Q&A already, but what do you see? How do you see this Russia-China alliance being impacted? We've seen China make moves recently, removing phytosanitary barriers to importing Russian wheat. How do you see this broader relationship playing out and the impact that it's going to have on agriculture trade?
I think that obviously China needs Russia because of the situation, which the sort of poor situation that's developed between the rest of the world and the Western world anyway, and China. They need Russia. They need the energy, and they need the grains. But it's also quite a challenge for China, because I don't think China wants to be seen as on the world stage as backing an aggressor. That's not in their best interest. And they also, I think, are making an enormous bet in the sense there's Xi Jinping. It's odd for a leader of a country, especially the size of China, in the 13th People's Congress, which is taking place as we speak. But over the weekend, when you look at what he said to the Congress, most of the major topics were around food security. It wasn't. It's shocking when you look at it. He was questioning things that I think we would take for granted. He was questioning, is China going to be able to protect the amount of arable land that it has? And he's putting tremendous measures in place to make sure he can protect that. And he seems very concerned that they're not. And of course we know they weren't, as cities expanded and land was used for other things. The second point was they completely changed, from non-GMO to GMO in January, and they want to be the leader in genetics in the world. So they're putting in place something to feed themselves, but their starting position on this is very weak, because they only have half the arable land per capita of the average in the world. And the average in the world is not good. So they have to be so much better than everybody else in order to feed themselves. Naturally, when they look north, they see Russia, a big landmass that could use a lot of capital, and it could be developed into much more. You only have to look at Ukraine versus Russia. And Shane, if I get this wrong, you correct me, okay? But from what I can see, is the yields coming out of Ukraine are far greater than the yields coming out of Russia on the same products. And in fact, the growth rate on wheat and maize and just about anything else you can look at has been superior. And that's because they've had Western help and capital flowing in. And so China's making a huge bet here that they can feed themselves. And that's what Xi Jinping wants to do. But if I was on the other side of that bet, I'd take Mother Nature, because they're betting against Mother Nature. And we know this is going to be one heck of an uphill battle here, with particularly with climate change issues. China is facing the worst wheat crop, according to the Minister of Agriculture, in modern history. And that's because they planted a third of it too late because of the rains that they had and the rough fall period. It was planted too late. So we have to add to that everything I showed you, the fact that the wheat crop in China this year, for all intents and purposes, is going to be the lousiest one they've had in certainly this generation.
And so Ted, building on that, again, the prices, that the changes that we've seen recently are certainly driven by the geopolitical issues. But as Sébastien talked about, these are not haven't just started, aren't happening just because of what's happening in the Ukraine. You talked about the tight supply and demand ratios that exist today, or stocks to utilization ratios that exist today. Again, was wondering, Ted or Sébastien, Shane, what's the reaction to this? So where do we, what potential broader responses do we see in the short and long term as we try and address and tackle this supply and demand equation on food and the impact that it's having on prices? Maybe Sébastien, do you want to go first on that?
I'm not sure I'm going to get the whole question, but yeah. So I'm sorry. Can you repeat it very?
I'm wondering what do you see as these short and long-term consequences of the tight supply and demand equation that exists today? How do you see people responding to that?
Okay, well, that tight supply and demand, so the obvious effect of it is on prices, and people react to prices. We had a question in the chat actually related a little bit to that, asking whether people will turn to lab-made food product. So perhaps not to that extent, but we're seeing grain prices going up, which means it's having an impact on livestock prices. And given that livestock prices are increasing and meat prices are increasing, people in the end might turn more toward like vegetable type of products. So one long-term possible impact is that shift we might observe. We already see people consuming less meat than before. We see that in Canada and the United States, less beef, less pork, and more chicken. So these meat products like chicken that are less feed intensive, that require less time and more quicker turnaround, ratio feed to output that is higher, their prices are not going to be impacted as much as beef and hogs. But and the other effect is that we might just see people turning more toward pulse products like beans and peas and maybe fake meat as their source of protein, because we expect less of an impact on those prices, on prices for those products than those for meat that directly depend on transforming those crops into protein through an animal. There's a more direct way that's probably less impacted by prices by going to direct consumption of pulse and beans.
Thank you, Shane. Did you want to jump in?
Yeah, I would say in addition, I agree with Sébastien that there's going to be a conversion to plant-based for protein at a higher rate than what we've seen in the last little while. Some of that was going to happen anyways because that's where we were heading, but I would add to that though that certainly in the long term, some of the set-aside land that they have in the United States, and that to a certain degree we have in a lot of Western countries, that's going to be converted to crop. We're going to see under more intensive farming in a lot of areas, and we discussed it yesterday when we're talking about this conversation, that in different places in the world, especially in places like South America and Argentina and Brazil, there's still lots of land there that isn't being utilized to the potential it could be. Could be, some of it's like the set aside land that you see in the United States where they're growing grass on it. Others is just underutilized land. But supply and demand dictates that more people will put more money into their crops, and there'll be more investment. Obviously, that investment is going to take some time to get in.
Ted, do you want to touch on this as well?
Well, I think the big concern I have is that Shane may be right, and because we've had a couple of studies just released in the last short while that indicate that particularly in Brazil, there's been a massive undercounting of the amount of land that's been already developed, and it goes through a cycle that we have to understand, is that they clear land both legally and illegally, and that there's a huge cost to the world for that, of course. And then you put cattle on it, but you only put cattle on it for a very brief period of time, and you put the cattle on it for a while, and then you convert it to soybean. And why I'm saying this is because we're going to destroy ourselves if we go that route, but B, it means that essentially our idea of what of just how productive we are is wrong, because we're out by Tyler, I think you've seen that document because CAPI's been working on it lately, but we're out by a factor of perhaps 10, something like that, in terms of we think we're more productive, but we've actually been bringing more land into production than is reality. And the satellite data that was just released by the World Resource Institute indicates that fully, that we've got that what we thought was productivity was actually more land coming into production, and then we're counting for. So the problem is pretty big. And yes, we could bring more land into production for sure, but that will cause us a bigger problem up the road. And the other point I would make is that there's a limit to what we can do quickly, because there would have to be some legislation both in the EU and in the US to bring these lands that have been taken out of production specifically for climate change purposes and others, and they're supposed to be growing trees. So that might happen. But when it does, the next thing is we're going to need that fertilizer that I showed you on those charts, and so that's another big issue. And the third point I would make is that I'm not so sure people that have been really understanding what's going on, particularly in the cattle industry, are well aware that it isn't a good idea to convert grassland to a cropland. Taking cattle off grassland is an insane thing to be doing, and we need the grasslands, and we need the cattle on the grasslands everywhere in the world. So I think we have to come up with other ideas of how we're going to be able to be more productive, intensify productivity in a way that's highly sustainable. And it can't be done overnight. So the answer, the end game is a lot of people are going to be hungrier. And yes, the prices will simply lower demand. Not in a very good way, but it will lower demand, and that will be how we get through this crisis. People will eat less.
Sébastien, I'm not sure if you've done forecasting around land use, or maybe I'm going to put you on the spot on this, but you talked about lower cattle margins or negative livestock margins. Ted just talked about conversion. Do you have any sense of what this will mean in that Canadian context if you look at the pressures that already existed around land use conversion and taking grasslands and putting them into row crop production?
Yeah, like Shane and Ted already said, we expect more use of marginal land because of that. We saw that in 2007, 2008, when we had like the biofuel effect and the we saw a lot more marginal land coming into production. There's some people propose ideas regarding CRP in the United States, actually using some of that land to increase production of various crops. So we're going to see that in Canada too. So people trying to turn into more marginal land into cropland. How much conversion is going to be about, pasture land into cropland, I don't really know, because that there's an impact in the long term of doing that too. So if we don't expect this cycle of price to last, farmers are not going to go into that direction and convert a big chunk of land into cropland if they don't think it's going to be over the long term. And if I may use this answer to actually respond to a question of the chat, someone asked about whether small crop acreages are going to sort of disappear because we see these corn, soybean, and canola and wheat prices going up. So what's going to happen with beans and peas and oats, barley, all these other crops? Well, the answer is that, the expression in English, I think, is a tide rises all boats. So we see corn prices going up, the wheat prices going up, but all other crops prices are going up. So the incentive for farms might be to switch a little bit toward one crop versus the other, but there's still profitability into raising other crops. So I don't expect really like lentils and peas acreage to drop significantly, and they're still going to be there. There's still a demand for these products, so farmers will respond to that. We just had 3 weeks ago, actually, India removing its tariff on lentils. I think lentils imports. So there's profitability in those crops too, and we still expect them to be planted. And farmers already committed in some way into planting some crops. So the shift can happen, but not a huge shift.
Tyler, can I add one point?
Yes.
The other thing that I think we all need to put in the back of our minds and think a little bit about is that, there is a lot going on in the edible oil world in both the U.S. and Canada, with plants being built to convert the soybeans and canola into essentially a renewable diesel. And if you put that in and I think most people on the call are probably aware of what those numbers look like in terms of acreage that would be required for that. We're in between a rock and a hard place here, because I fully understand why people are doing that when essentially we both, particularly in Canada, where our canola business got shut out of China. So that's a China, a problem that they've created, that where the rest of the world is going to pay for that solution, in a sense. And but I do think this situation may have some effect on how fast we go forward with all those things.
There have been a couple of questions that have come up around how governments respond to this issue, this unfolding crisis. For example, one of the questions in the chat is around, how do we balance this, green policies that are encouraging reduced fertilizer use versus the need to maximize production. A question around what generally should governments be doing to respond. Should Canada be moving more in the direction of aquaculture products where there seems to be potentially less of a play here? Would anybody, there's again a lot pulled up against there, but I think at its core gets to be a question of what do governments do. Would someone like to offer some thoughts on that? Shane, would you like to take this first?
Yeah, so I'm going to answer the question kind of in a roundabout way, because I think the real question is relates to, obviously there's been damage done already. We don't know the extent of the damage. But if I was a policymaker, I would be asking myself, well, how long is this going to last? How, what's the short-term impact? What's the long-term impact? As Ted rightly said, it's great to put more land into production, but what's the environmental consequence of that? All those are true things that all need to be weighed when you're making decisions. What I do know is in the short term that people need to be fed, and so we're going to do whatever we have to globally to try to make sure that everybody gets fed, whether that means, as Sébastien pointed out, eating less meat in the short term or doing whatever we need to do. But we really don't know what the direct result is going to be. And what we do know is that certainly wheat and corn is going to be affected. Corn and sunflowers is going to have some effect on it because people aren't concentrating on planting them. We know that the wheat's been put into the ground and maybe they're not adding the correct fertilizers or spraying at the correct times, but that crop is certainly in the ground right now, 95% of it. We don't know, who it's going to be sold to, how it's going to be harvested, what the conditions are, but there's lots of variables out there. And I think my personal opinion is that policy makers will be watching the next 2 to 4 weeks, and during that period of time, we're going to have a pretty good idea as to what the duration is going to be. That's my thoughts. I think it's a difficult thing to be making policies right now when we don't know how the world's going to be divided up in the future.
Yeah, Tyler, can I add to that?
Yes.
I think the first thing is that, I hope all our government officials take the Hippocratic oath right now with the idea of do no harm. Because we are in a difficult and unknown situation. So I think one of the pieces of advice would be to delay anything that's going to be adverse to production this year. Whatever was in the chute to come forward, just delay it. And look at longer term. I think we're going to see not only Canada, but many countries looking at how do I become more resilient? And one of those ways is over time to begin to become less dependent on particularly on imported fertilizers. I think that's a key piece here. We have no problem in Canada, as you know, with 2 of those fertilizers. We're a net exporter, so we're pretty good in that one. We got to really focus on the phosphate one. That's the one that we get a problem with. And Europe has an extreme problem because they've created it. They've added a layer of problems with that one. When they're so dependent on bringing that in from Russia that they actually went ahead and put a maximum standard for cadmium in their fertilizers, so they cannot import from North Africa. If you import from North Africa with that, you have a cadmium level. And so one of the things we could do in Canada, I think, is we could be a leader in 2 areas. One, I think we're moving ahead with regenerative techniques, but it takes time. That's not an overnight thing. I think we're finding that both in Eastern and Western Canada. As you know, CAPI's had a big project around some of those areas. You've had webinars on it. I think we're making progress, but we keep heading in that direction. But that's not next year's solution. And in the same time, we really look at that one piece of fertilizer that we're dependent on imports. Most of ours come from the U.S. But we can actually become a leader in essentially recycling phosphates. As you know, every city in the world is a phosphate dump essentially, and you can just recycle that back through struvite back into farms. We have some legislative challenges there because struvite from humans is not allowed in organic farming, and Europe is making it allowable right now. So that's one of the things we could physically do, but do no harm. Stop anything that would, for example, some of the climate issues, mitigation issues that are being put forward. We can just delay those for a bit. We don't have to stop them. We can delay them and work them into a more systematic change, rather than trying to do things overnight.
Thank you, Ted and Sébastien. Did you want to add anything on this?
Yeah, very quickly. I don't really know what the governments can do and whether they should do at least something in the short term. Perhaps it's going to lead to some, I hope, long-term decisions and not just short-term fixes. And one fix, a short-term fix that I see that could be proposed is changing rules regarding biofuels. So it's always that debate that we've had over the last 15, 20 years about food versus fuel. And I haven't seen so far any change made to rules mandating biofuel production. On one hand, I'm not sure they can really stop producing biofuel, especially ethanol, because we require ethanol right now for a question of firing the engine and octane minimum. So I don't see ethanol going disappearing. So there's still a lot of incentive for producing biofuel right now. Oil prices being high is one of those incentives, and there are the regulatory incentives, and haven't seen them or put on pause or anything right now, and I don't expect them to go away either.
Thank you, Sébastien. Thank you to our three panelists. Again, this is we were in the early days of something that will have long-term consequences, and I'd like to end with paraphrasing a comment that's a question in the chat, but you know, we have this potential downward spiral that likely a path we were on already, but is getting sped up because of what we're seeing in the Ukraine today around decreased food production, climate change decreasing our ability to produce food, pushing more land conversion, potentially making climate change and emissions worse. You know, the comment in the chat is that we need more global cooperation, not less, to break that downwards cycle. And I think that that's something that I heard very clearly throughout the chat. Again, whether or not we're talking about agriculture in the Ukraine or Canada, clearly we are all part of a global system that needs to work well to make sure that we can produce the affordable, accessible, and available food people need to eat. This is something that we will continue to look at and talk about at CAPI. I think you can expect to hear more from us on this topic in the future. Again, thank you very much for joining us today. Thank you to our panelists for being with us, and have a great day, everyone.